Submarine worth approximately $400 million was heading towards the Kronstadt repair base in St. Petersburg. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. This submarine was one of the most mysterious and feared Russian submarines, known as a black hole. This was the final and most dangerous stage of a journey spanning thousands of kilometers. 030. The submarine captain had just passed through Denmark's Great Belt Strait and reached the open waters of the Baltic Sea, the narrow passage between Denmark and Sweden known as the Kattegat. However, this voyage in the Baltic Sea was not a submerged one. It was on the surface with a Russian tugboat, the Yakov Grabsky, slowly towing this 2,350-ton giant above water. 051. They were only hours away from delivering their secret intelligence to bases in Kaliningrad and then St. Petersburg. Perhaps he thought he had overcome the most difficult part. He was approaching safe waters. This was a critical mistake because the Russian submarine would soon face disproportionate force. Seconds later, suddenly they appeared on the horizon. 110. First in the sky. Two dots turned into a scream faster than sound. JAS-39 Gripen jets belonging to the Swedish Air Force. The Russian submarine captain didn't notice them. He didn't understand where they came from. He couldn't comprehend how they had locked onto him so quickly right above him because he couldn't. 128. The submarine's own radar wasn't working. Its navigation systems had completely failed days earlier in the middle of the Atlantic. Its periscope was malfunctioning. The submarine was quite literally blind. 930 Ruby Air Base, Sweden. At the same time, two JAS-39 Gripen E fighter jets belonging to the F-17 wing in Navy took off from the runway, firing their afterburners. 154. These aircraft were taking off not only to secure air superiority, but also to provide critical intelligence support for the operation at sea with their advanced sensors. The sky suddenly split with the roar of the JAS-39 Gripes. This was not a hello. This was a show of force. This was pouncing on the prey. They were loaded with deadly Meteor air-to-air missiles and ship-killing RBS-15 missiles. Airlock was applied. 219. Two Gripen jets flew low over the submarine convoy. One of them passed just a few dozen meters above Novorossiysk, banking its wings at a dangerous angle. The turbulence created by the jet shook the submarine's deck. It was a declaration of absolute dominance. This submarine was Project 636.3. It was supposed to be one of the world's quietest diesel-electric submarines, dubbed the Black Hole of the Ocean by NATO. 247. Its primary weapon was the Caliber cruise missile. It was a nightmare for NATO. Its entire power came from its stealth. And now that stealth was being shattered right in the middle of the Baltic. This was the greatest mistake a submarine could make. Without stealth, it was no different from a floating hulk of metal. 304. And Novorossiysk was exactly that at that moment. Moreover, this submarine was not returning from a simple patrol. It was returning to base with the critical intelligence information it had obtained in the Mediterranean. The Russian captain probably thought they were only after that information. He was scrambling to protect this data. 321. But he didn't know that the real opportunity, the real critical intelligence wasn't the disks it carried, but the ship itself. For the Swedish Navy, obtaining this opportunity normally would have cost billions of dollars. However, the Russian Navy's critical mistake would make it very cheap. The ESM pods connected to the Gripen's Erexis electronic warfare suite absorbed, classified, and exposed every electronic whisper leaking from the submarine. 349. Desperate attempts at communication, interference emitted by malfunctioning systems, a digital heist. The PS-05/AMK-4 ESA radar scanned every detail on the surface at an atomic level, while the Skyward GIST system mapped heat anomalies on the hull, confirming the extent of the damage. The Russian crew floundered inside a steel cage both above and below the water. 414. The Russian crew inside that metal coffin heard that sound tearing through the sky. The hull of the ship was shaking with vibration. It was absolute chaos. Complete panic. A Russian submarine and Russian admirals had never felt so vulnerable. The submarine and its crew wanted to dive to the bottom, but they couldn't. 434. Diving would have been suicide. As Russian security sources would later leak, there were more than 10 catastrophic failures on board. And the most terrifying, that leaking fuel system. That highly flammable diesel fuel was filling the interior of the vessel. Going underwater meant that the leaks would intensify with the increasing pressure. 453. And most importantly, in a closed space filled with fuel vapor, a single spark would mean the instant vaporization of the 80-person crew. At that moment, on the morning of October 15th, the Russian crew had only one priority: to survive. The Swedes' harassment was a secondary problem alongside the bomb ready to explode inside the ship. 513. They were not on a warship. They were in a metal coffin, and they knew it. While the crew was focused on the sky, the second wave came, this time from the sea. Ghosts invisible on radar 15 minutes after the Air Force, the Navy sprang into action. With orders from Jew, sirens blared at the Karlskrona base. 532. The pride of the Swedish Navy, two Visby-class corvettes, HMS Karlstad and HMS Niding, quickly left their berths. These ships were no ordinary warships. They were hunters specially designed for the shallow island-dotted and complex waters of the Baltic. Nearly invisible to radar, their fusion composite hulls made them nearly invisible to Russian sensors which were already malfunctioning. 556. Their mission was simple: to intercept Novorossiysk as quickly as possible, surround it, and continue NATO's live autopsy operation. Originally launched in the Atlantic under Baltic distinguishable from a seagull on radar. 6:40. Before the Russian tugboat could comprehend what was happening, the two Swedish warships had taken positions on the submarine's port and starboard sides. There was no escape. The 57mm Bofors guns on their decks had their barrels trained directly on the Navarrese's conning tower. In the ship's armory, Saab-made state-of-the-art Torpedo 47 light torpedoes awaited the order to fire. 7:02. This was a declaration of threat in international waters.
Sonar.
The slightest deviation, the slightest wrong order could lead to disaster. There was nothing the Russian captain could do. 0. The submarine was being towed by a tugboat. Its engines were malfunctioning. Its weapon systems were offline. It was completely defenseless. 7:21. High-frequency active payings emanating from the sonar dome of HMS Karlstad began mercilessly striking the metal hull of the Novorossiysk. This was not a detection, but an interrogation, forcibly extracting the hull secrets. Each echo mapped the double-hulled structure, the internal compartments, the welded seams, the potential points of damage in 3 dimensions. 7:43. Passive arrays, meanwhile, were picking up the Kilo class's most intimate secrets, the hum of auxiliary generators, hydraulic system leaks, the acoustic signature of each valve. HMS Nidoping approached Novorosiysk's side, coming almost close enough to touch its hull. This was an extremely aggressive maneuver, pushing the boundaries of PSEAM rules. 8:03. High-resolution cameras recorded every rust spot, every scratch mark on the hull. The Russian officers on the bridge could do nothing but watch this humiliation with anger and helplessness. The reports they sent to headquarters over the radio were fragmented and panicked. A counterattack would have been suicide. 8:22. Their own fatal mistake surfacing in the Kremlin's strategic fiasco. The collapse of Mediterranean logistics had thrown them into this death trap. On the surface, towed by a tugboat, they were surrounded by ships and aircraft from one of the world's most advanced navies. Their secrecy was gone, their weapons meaningless. This was a complete fiasco. 8:43. Their only hope was for this humiliating journey to end as soon as possible and reach the safe waters of the shipyard. At that moment, a third layer, unnoticed, unseen, and unheard by the Russian crew came into play. High above the Gripen fighters among the clouds, Sweden's submarine hunter aircraft, the Saab 340 Maritime Patrol, MPA, or Airborne Early Warning and Control E1C variants were circling. 9:10. They were not noisy like the Gripen fighters. They were silent operators. They were the brain of the operation. While the Gripens carried out visual harassment and the Vispies posed the underwater threat, the Saab 340s were stealing the soul of the hunt. This was an opportunity, not just a military opportunity, but an invaluable intelligence opportunity. 9:31. It was a live autopsy. A submarine's greatest secret was not the intelligence it carried or the action it was about to carry out. Its greatest secret was its acoustic signature, that unique sound produced by its engine, propeller, auxiliary power units, cooling pumps, its fingerprint. This is its identity in the ocean. Normally, NATO would send its billion-dollar nuclear submarines on risky cat-and-mouse operations to capture this signature. 10 o'clock. But now, on the morning of October 15th, there was no need. Novorossiysk was presenting all these secrets along with the sounds it made while operating in different failure modes on a silver platter directly to the hydrophones of the Swedish hunters. The Vispi's most sensitive hydrophones were recording every decibel, every frequency, every vibration. 10:21. At that moment, the submarine had to run its diesel generators to stay on the surface and maintain life support. The Swedes recorded the acoustic signature of these generators under strain, the sound of those leaking fuel pumps, the faulty ballast systems, the ventilation fans working in panic. All of it was now in NATO's library, even when towed by a tugboat. Its propeller leaves a trail in the water. 10:43. The Swedes recorded the unique cavitation sound produced by the submarine's propeller as it was towed at different speeds in passive mode. This would make detecting it in passive mode 1,000 times easier in the future. The Saab 340 Hunter aircraft above were delivering the most lethal blow with their high-precision ESM electronic support measures receivers. 11:07. They were absorbing every electronic signal and magnetic signature emitted by this helpless target on the water surface. They recorded every paying, every frequency, every pulse repetition emitted by the Russian submarines, if operational, surface search radars, communication antennas. This was a treasure trove for NATO's electronic warfare library. 11:29. They now knew the submarine's electronic fingerprint. 2. They also extracted the target's magnetic anomaly detector MAD signature by making low passes over it. That unique distortion this massive metal mass creates on the Earth's magnetic field. This was not an opportunity. This was a robbery. Sweden on behalf of NATO was forcibly stealing one of Russia's most valuable military secrets in broad daylight in the middle of the Baltic Sea. 11:58. This relentless interrogation and dissection operation continued for hours. Sweden and NATO now knew all the weaknesses of the Kilo class. When this phase of the operation was complete, the green fighters returned to their bases. The Visby corvettes and Saab 340 Hunters departed the area with the invaluable data they had collected. 12:17. But the message over the Baltic
multiple distinct pings bearing 2900.
Yeah. We've got it all.
This decision changed the geopolitical map of the Baltic Sea overnight forever. Even a cursory glance at the map laid bare this painful truth. 1343. The Baltic Sea was no longer a Russian playground. It was a suffocating NATO lake surrounding St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad, eliminating their room for maneuver. It was a deadly trap. The Danish Straits, the only outlet for the Russian Baltic fleet to the Atlantic Ocean. This was Russia's only lifeline to the Atlantic. 1403. And now that lifeline was in NATO's hands. Novorossiysk was the first and largest prey to fall into this trap. And for Sweden, this was a historic opportunity. This was the rematch of the 1981 Whiskey on the Rocks incident. That day, a nuclear-armed Soviet submarine had run ground in the heart of Sweden, humiliating Stockholm. Today, on October 15, 2025, Sweden was collecting that debt with interest in full view of the entire world. 1430. This was not a hunt. This was historical justice itself. In fact, it all began on October 9. The roots of this fiasco stretch back weeks to October 9. Thousands of km west to the Atlantic Ocean. Novorossiysk was in the Mediterranean. It belonged to Russia's Black Sea Fleet, but it couldn't return home. 1451. The captain had to go to Tartus in Syria or the Novorossiysk base in the Black Sea, not St. Petersburg, but he couldn't go. A critical strategic mistake had closed all doors. Putin's mistake on February 24, 2022. The first lock was Turkey's Montreux Convention. Turkey, relying on international law against Russia's invasion of Ukraine, closed those strategic gates, the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits, to Russian warships. 1517. This was a diplomatic wall. It was impenetrable. The Black Sea Fleet was trapped in the Mediterranean. The second lock was Ukraine. Those daring, cheap, but deadly unmanned aerial vehicles. They had turned the Russian supply lines, repair facilities, and even warships in the Black Sea into hell, one by one. This was a logistical nightmare. 1538. Russia was paralyzed in its own backyard, the Black Sea. The third lock was the Tartus base in Syria. According to renowned OSINT analyst Hy Sutton, this base was now a trap. It was cut off from the mainland with zero resupply and repair capabilities. So when those catastrophic failures began in Novorossiysk, there was no safe harbor left for the crew to take refuge in the Baltic Sea. 1604. But the journey turned into a tragedy off the coast of France. It was then, in the middle of the sea, that more than 10 catastrophic failures began. Navigation collapsed. The software failed in that deadly leak. Diesel fuel began to fill the crew's living quarters. Panic. Chaos. The captain faced an impossible choice. Either die at the bottom of the sea, exploding in their own fuel vapors, or commit the ultimate sin. Surface. 1630. October 9th. Off the coast of Brittany, right in the heart of NATO, the Novorossiysk surfaced. That moment was when Russia lost all control in the Mediterranean. That moment was when the Black Hole legend died. That moment was when the honor of the Russian Navy sank and NATO hunters smelled blood. There was an unexpected guest. 1651. The first to notice was a French FM frigate and Gambit began. This was not a rescue operation. This was an information warfare operation. NATO Maritime Command Markham released that high-resolution humiliating photo to the world. The message was clear. We are watching. This was a psychological slap in the face for the Kremlin. 1712. There was no chance of hiding the fiasco. Russia's quietest hunter had suddenly become the world's loudest wreck. The Russian tugboat Yakov Grabsky was attached to the wreck and the 6,000 kilometers convoy of shame began. They entered the English Channel. A British Royal Navy Type 23 frigate took over the mission. 1732. The Russian submarine was towed past the tip of London's nose like a circus animal. This was the height of humiliation. Every moment was recorded. Every sound. That precious acoustic signature was listened to. They entered the North Sea. This time, the Belgian and Dutch navies took over. It was a perfectly synchronized, multi-layered, suffocating siege. 1753. These were the first stages of that live autopsy. And then came the deadly psychological blow. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. He made a sarcastic reference to Tom Clancy's famous novel, The Hunt for Red October. This doesn't look much like The Hunt for Red October. It looks more like Operation Find the Nearest Repairman. This was a global joke. 1814. Putin's image of an invincible navy was shattered by this single sentence. And the convoy reached the Danish Straits on the morning of October 15th at the entrance to the Baltic at the gate of the NATO lake. And they're their new hunters, Sweden, were waiting for them. In short, what is being hunted in the cold waters of the Baltic Sea is not just a rusty submarine struggling with technical malfunctions. 1837. What is being hunted is the illusion of great power that Vladimir Putin has painstakingly built over 25 years. What is being hunted is the honor of the Russian Navy. What is being hunted is the once held myth of invincibility of Russian military technology. This metal coffin has become the most concrete and painful symbol of an empire's dream. 1858. Drowned before a single torpedo was fired due to its leader's strategically disastrous mistakes and a systemic cancer ingrained in the regime's veins. This was not a fiasco. NATO now knew the secret of all kiloclase submarines, including the secret of their defective state. This was an absolute victory of intelligence over brute force, of integrated technology over a rotten system. 1924. This was an irreparable fracture. Thank you for choosing us.